The assembly deck of the Eternal Meridian held 347 souls, and not one of them dared to breathe. Queen Alara Theron stood at the platform's edge, her silver robes catching the overhead lights like captured starlight. Her eyes swept across the gathered crew with the patience of someone who had commanded vessels since before most of them had been born. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became unbearable. "I will ask one more time," she said, her voice carrying across the deck and without need for amplification. "Who fixed this ship?" The engineers in their formal uniforms stood rigid. The officers in their ceremonial dress remained motionless. The maintenance crews in their work grays stared at their boots as if the deck plating held answers to questions they didn't want asked. Then from the back ranks past the decorated senior staff and beyond the mid-level technicians, a hand rose. Not confidently, not hesitantly, simply rose. The crowd parted like water, and a figure in plain gray coveralls stepped forward. Human, female. Mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid that had seen better days. Her coveralls bore the basic insignia of a Grade 3 maintenance technician, the kind of rating assigned to people who cleaned filters and replaced worn seals. Every eye in the assembly locked onto her. Every breath held. Queen Alara's expression shifted surprise, quickly masked. "You have a name, I presume. Finn Marlowe, Your Majesty." The human's voice carried steady and clear. "Maintenance technician, 3rd grade, Section 7 crew." A murmur rippled through the assembly, whispers in the musical Valerian language fragments of shock and disbelief. A human impossible. How could she? Finn stood without the rigid formality of military bearing, but also without the slouch of fear. Just a straightforward stance that suggested she was exactly what she appeared to be and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Queen Alara studied her with renewed intensity. "You fixed my ship." "Yes, Your Majesty. I recalibrated the quantum flux regulator, which allowed the cascade recovery protocols to function properly." Finn paused. "So depending on how you define fixed, it's either me or the ship's own systems. But I started the process." The murmur grew louder. Finn noticed the chief engineer's ears flatten against his head, a Valerian expression of profound discomfort. "Come with me," Queen Alara said, her tone allowing no argument. Now, 5 days earlier, the Eternal Meridian shuddered as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and Finn felt the vibration through the deck plating beneath her boots. A tremor that lasted 3 seconds too long and resonated at entirely the wrong frequency. She paused mid-step in the corridor of Section 7 maintenance kit dangling from one hand and frowned at the wall. "That's not right." The thought came unbidden the way thoughts did when you'd spent 2 years living in the spaces between spaces of a warship learning its rhythms like a mechanic learns the heartbeat of an engine. Finn had worked in these maintenance tunnels long enough to distinguish between the normal groans of a vessel that had seen 3 decades of service and the particular sounds that meant someone's day was about to get dramatically worse. This was definitely the latter. The ship lurched again harder this time, and the lighting flickered from its normal golden warmth to emergency blue before stabilizing. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began its polite Valerian chime, the kind that sounded less like a warning of imminent disaster and more like a gentle reminder that perhaps one should consider being concerned at one's earliest convenience. Finn's communicator crackled to life. "All non-essential personnel remain at your stations. Engineering teams report to primary assembly point Beta. This is not a drill. But please don't panic. Panicking is inefficient." Only the Valerians would phrase an emergency alert with a reminder about emotional efficiency. Finn almost smiled, but the deck vibrated again, and this time the lights took longer to recover. She continued toward her assigned section, moving through corridors that were becoming increasingly empty as crew members hurried to their emergency positions. The Eternal Meridian was massive, a flagship that could house 3,000 personnel when fully crewed. Right now, it was operating with minimal staff following the diplomatic mission to the outer territories. Most of the ship felt hollow, the kind of quiet that made every footstep echo. When she reached the ventilation access point in Section 7 Delta, Finn could hear voices carrying through the air circulation system. Fragments of conversation from the main engineering bay, 3 decks above. The Valerian engineers were in full crisis mode, which she could tell because their normally melodic language had taken on the rapid-fire staccato of people who were professionally trying not to use profanity while describing technically impossible failures. 17 primary networks showing cascade failure. Impossible. The redundancy protocols should have quantum flux distribution, reading 0 across the entire dorsal grid. Finn opened her maintenance kit and began her routine inspection of the ventilation motors, but her attention was divided. 17 networks, cascade failure. Those words didn't belong together unless something had gone catastrophically wrong with the ship's fundamental power architecture. She finished checking the ventilation system, which was ironically working perfectly, and was about to move to her next assignment when the entire ship went dark. Not emergency lighting dark. Absolute darkness. The kind that only happened when even the backup systems had given up. For 5 heartbeats, the eternal meridian was a tomb of metal floating in the void of space. Finn stood perfectly still in the blackness, her hand still on the ventilation access panel, and felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Then auxiliary power kicked in, bathing everything in dim red light that made the corridor look like the inside of a failing heart. Her communicator crackled again, this time with the voice of Chief Engineer Davrin Torval. His usual composed demeanor had developed some serious cracks. All personnel be advised. The Eternal Meridian has suffered critical systems failure. We are operating on auxiliary power only. Repeat, auxiliary power only. Command staff is being notified. That was Valerian speak for, "We have no idea what happened. We have no idea how to fix it. And we're about to tell the Queen that her personal flagship is currently a very large, very expensive piece of space debris." Finn stood in the red-lit corridor doing mental calculations she definitely wasn't qualified to be doing. 17 primary networks didn't just fail simultaneously. The Eternal Meridian systems were designed by people who assumed enemies would be shooting at them. Redundancy was built into redundancy with backup systems for the backup systems. For everything to cascade like this, the failure point had to be somewhere fundamental, something that affected power distribution across multiple isolated networks. She pulled out her datapad and accessed the maintenance logs. She'd been keeping unofficial records of anomalies she'd noticed over the past 6 months. Things that weren't quite right, but also weren't quite wrong enough to trigger automated alerts. The kind of subtle shifts that only someone who spent 12 hours a day in the ship's guts would notice. There. A pattern in the power distribution fluctuations. Tiny variations in the quantum flux regulator's output, each one within acceptable parameters, when measured individually, but showing a clear degradation trend when viewed over time. The regulator was original equipment, 37 years old, designed to last forever or near enough that nobody bothered checking it anymore. Except nothing lasted forever. Finn closed her datapad and made a decision that would either save her career or end it. She headed deeper into Section 7 toward the maintenance access tunnels that led to the aft power distribution junction. The auxiliary lighting didn't extend this far, so she pulled out her personal work light, a battered device she'd modified to put out twice its rated lumens, because regulation lighting was for people who didn't spend half their life in crawl spaces. The junction access was behind a panel marked with Valerian script that translated roughly to authorized personnel only. "This means you, yes you, don't touch this." Finn had never been entirely clear whether she counted as authorized personnel for this particular definition. But since she was currently the only personnel in this section, she decided to interpret the rules generously. The panel came away easily, revealing the junction chamber, a spherical space 3 meters across, lined with crystalline power conduits that glowed faintly even in the ship's crippled state. At the center hung the quantum flux regulator, a device about the size of Finn's head that looked like someone had convinced pure mathematics to take physical form. Its surface should have been alive with flowing patterns of light. Instead, it pulsed erratically, a stuttering rhythm that made Finn's teeth hurt. "There you are," she whispered. "You magnificent, temperamental, overcomplicated piece of work." She pulled up the diagnostic interface on her datapad, knowing this was the point of no return. If she accessed Royal Vessel systems without authorization, she'd be violating about 40 different regulations. If she tried to recalibrate a component this critical and failed, she might actually damage something that currently just needed adjustment. But if she was right, she could fix the Queen's ship in days instead of months. The diagnostic interface blinked to life, and Finn started reading the quantum field calibration data looking for the baseline parameters this regulator had been drifting away from for over 3 decades. Her fingers moved across the controls with practiced confidence, the kind that came from having fixed too many impossible things to be intimidated by merely difficult ones. But as the data populated her screen, her confidence evaporated, replaced by ice-cold fear. Finn ran the simulation 3 times, hoping each iteration would prove the previous one wrong. Each time the results came back the same. She sat on the deck plating of the junction chamber, her back against the curved wall, staring at her datapad in the dim glow of emergency lighting. Her hands had started to shake, so she pressed them flat against the cold metal floor until they steadied. The quantum flux regulator wasn't just out of calibration, it was degrading. Had been degrading for years, decades actually. A slow molecular breakdown in the crystalline matrix that handled quantum state transitions. The kind of degradation that happened so gradually that diagnostics compared each reading to the previous one and found the variance acceptable. Always within parameters, always just a fraction of a percent different from yesterday's reading. Except yesterday's reading had been a fraction of a percent different from the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that, for 37 years. Finn pulled up the ship's FTL transition logs and cross-referenced them with the regulator's historical performance data. The pattern was there clear as starlight once you knew what to look for. Each faster-than-light jump put stress on the regulator. Each stress event accelerated the degradation just slightly. Each acceleration brought the system closer to the threshold where calibration drift became catastrophic failure. They'd crossed that threshold 4 hours ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what would happen on the next FTL transition. Finn's fingers moved across the datapad, running power distribution models, calculating energy thresholds, building a simulation of what the regulator would do under the stress of another faster-than-light jump in its current degraded state. The simulation completed. Finn stared at the results and her blood turned to ice. If the Eternal Meridian attempted another FTL transition with the regulator, in its current state, the quantum flux distribution would collapse entirely within the first 3 seconds of jump initiation. The collapse would feed back through all 17 primary networks simultaneously, not as a controlled shutdown, but as an uncontrolled energy discharge. The ship's fusion core, suddenly receiving contradictory regulation signals from a dying component, would attempt to compensate, would fail, would breach containment. Core breach on a vessel this size, this close to a populated colony station. Finn ran the casualty projections with trembling hands. 3,000 crew aboard the Eternal Meridian, 12,000 civilians on colony station. Meridian 7 currently in orbital sink just 400 kilometers away. Total potential casualties, 15,247 lives. Give or take whoever happened to be in nearby shipping lanes when a fusion core decided to briefly become a miniature star. The number sat on her screen like an accusation, like a weight pressing down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. 15,000 people. Finn sat back against the cold wall and forced herself to think past the panic. She should report this, should go straight to Chief Engineer Torval, show him the data, let the people with 40 years of experience and walls full of certifications make the decision about what to do next. Except they had already made their decision. 4 months in a shipyard, comprehensive reconstruction, a timeline that assumed the problem was complex and deep and would require teams of specialists to diagnose and repair. Would they believe a human maintenance technician who'd been cleaning their air filters for 2 years? Would they take her simulation models seriously when their own diagnostic systems, infinitely more sophisticated than her modified datapad, had declared the cascade failure an unpredictable anomaly? And even if they believed her, how long would it take to convince them? How many levels of bureaucracy would she have to navigate? How many senior engineers would need to review her work, verify her calculations, debate the proper course of action? The Eternal Meridian was scheduled to depart for the capital in 72 hours. Queen Alara would return from her diplomatic mission aboard her flagship and order an FTL jump back to the homeworld. And 15,000 people would die because nobody listened to the maintenance tech who cleaned the filters. Finn thought about Earth, about the aerospace engineering firm where she'd worked 5 years ago, about the safety reports she'd discovered had been falsified to save money, about standing up in a meeting and presenting evidence that her supervisor had been signing off on components he knew were defective, about being escorted from the building an hour later, about the lawsuit that had drained her savings and destroyed her reputation, about the blacklist that meant no engineering firm on Earth would hire her, about ending up here on an alien warship cleaning filters and being invisible because it was the only job in the galaxy that didn't require her to pretend the past hadn't happened. She'd thought she was done making hard choices, done being the person who saw the disaster coming and couldn't walk away. But some things you couldn't leave behind just by leaving the planet. Finn stood up, brushed the dust off her coveralls, and pulled up the regulator's recalibration interface. "Okay," she said to the empty junction chamber. To the dying regulator, to herself, to the ghost of who she used to be before Earth had taught her that telling the truth cost everything. "Let's save some lives." The first night was about understanding. Finn had worked on complex systems before, back when she'd been an actual engineer, instead of someone who cleaned things other engineers didn't want to think about. But Valerian technology operated on principles that human engineering was still trying to fully comprehend. Quantum mechanics made flesh. Physics persuaded to bend just slightly further than physics was comfortable with. She couldn't just recalibrate the regulator like she was adjusting a combustion timing sequence. She had to understand what it had been, what it had become, and how to convince it to remember the difference. The crystalline matrix at the regulator's core was designed to maintain quantum coherence across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. That coherence had degraded the molecular bonds that held the crystal structure stable, had been slowly breaking down, creating microscopic fractures that disrupted the quantum field. You couldn't fix fractures in a crystalline quantum matrix, but you could compensate for them. Finn spent the first 12 hours mapping the fracture patterns, cross-referencing them with the regulator's power distribution logs, building a three-dimensional model of how the damage had propagated through the crystal over decades. Every fracture changed how the regulator processed energy. Every change had been gradual enough that the system had adapted around it. The regulator wasn't broken. It had evolved into a broken state so slowly that it thought its broken state was normal. She needed to teach it otherwise. The work consumed her. Hours blurred together. She ate nutrition bars from her maintenance kit without tasting them. Slept in 15-minute increments on the hard deck plating when exhaustion made her hands shake too badly to work. The junction chamber became her entire world, just her, the dying regulator, and the weight of 15,000 lives depending on her getting this right. By the time the second night began, Finn had a plan. A completely unauthorized, probably insane, definitely career-ending plan. But a plan. She would reprogram the regulator's baseline parameters to account for the crystalline fractures. Instead of trying to restore it to factory specifications, which would just make the fractures more unstable, she would create a new operational profile that worked with the damage instead of against it. It was elegant in theory. In practice, it meant rewriting core protocols on a device that was currently the only thing preventing the ship from being completely dead in space, while hiding from security patrols in the dark with improvised tools, and a ticking clock counting down to Queen Alara's return. Finn got to work. The maintenance access tunnels became her world. She moved through them like a ghost using maintenance schedules she'd memorized over 2 years to avoid patrols and engineering teams. Her modified work light stayed on its dimmest setting. Her communicator stayed muted. She existed in the spaces between attention, the gaps in official awareness. The third night was the hardest, not because of the technical work, though that was hard enough, requiring concentration so intense that time seemed to stop and her hands seemed to belong to someone else, someone who knew what she was doing and wasn't terrified of making a mistake that would doom 15,000 people. No. The third night was hard because of the doubt. She'd been working for 67 hours straight. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the simulation results, the casualty projections, the moment when she'd chosen to act instead of report. What if she was wrong? What if the simulation was based on faulty assumptions? What if there was some safety mechanism she didn't know about that would prevent the catastrophic failure? What if she was down here in the dark, violating 4 regulations, risking her career and possibly her freedom for nothing? What if she succeeded in recalibrating the regulator and it turned out the chief engineer had been right? What if the problem was something else entirely? Something her human understanding of Valerian technology had missed, and her intervention just made things worse. Finn paused with her hands on the recalibration interface, her exhausted brain spiraling through scenarios of failure and consequence. Then she thought about the children on Colony Station Meridian 7. 12,000 civilians, which meant families, kids in schools, people living ordinary lives who had no idea they were 400 kilometers away from a fusion core that was one bad decision away from vaporizing them. And she went back to work. The final calibration sequence took 4 hours. 4 hours of making microscopic adjustments to quantum field parameters, testing each change against her simulation models, verifying that the regulator could maintain coherence under the stress of FTL transition. She worked with the focused intensity of someone diffusing a bomb because that's essentially what she was doing. Every parameter adjustment changed the quantum field dynamics. Every change rippled through the system in ways that could either stabilize the regulator or push it past the point of no return. Her hands stopped shaking somewhere around hour 3. The fear crystallized into something harder, colder, more useful. She wasn't Finn Marlowe, disgraced engineer turned maintenance tech anymore. She was just someone solving a problem because the problem needed solving, and she was the only one who could do it. When she finally initiated the restoration protocol, her hands were steady on the control panel. The regulator pulsed once, twice. For a moment, nothing happened, and Finn's heart stopped. Then its erratic rhythm smoothed. The stuttering light patterns resolved into flowing coherent waves. The quantum field stabilized, found its new baseline, and locked into parameters that acknowledged what it had become instead of demanding it be what it had been. And throughout the eternal meridian, systems began coming online, one by one, network by network. Like a heart remembering how to beat, Finn monitored the restoration for 12 hours, watching the ship's power distribution stabilize, checking and rechecking her work, looking for any sign that her recalibration had introduced new problems or missed critical factors. Everything held steady. The auxiliary lighting faded as primary systems came online. The red glow of emergency power gave way to the normal golden warmth of a ship that was alive and healthy. Finn could hear the change in the ship's ambient sound, the subtle shift from the bare minimum hum of survival systems to the fuller chorus of a vessel operating at full capacity. She'd done it. She'd fixed the Queen's ship. She'd saved 15,000 lives, and nobody knew. Finn collapsed onto the deck plating of the junction chamber, her back against the curved wall, and felt something between triumph and terror and exhaustion settle into her bones. Her datapad lay beside her, still showing the simulation results. The casualty projections that would never come true now. 15,247 lives. She could walk away. Replace the access panel, return to her quarters, pretend she'd spent the last 3 days doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Let the engineers discover that their impossible problem had solved itself. Let them puzzle over the mystery. Let them file reports about spontaneous system restoration and unpredictable quantum phenomena. Let them never know that a human maintenance technician had saved 15,000 lives while they were declaring the problem unsolvable. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that would let her keep her job and her obscurity and the comfortable invisibility she'd built over 2 years. But it was also a lie, and Finn had spent 5 years learning that lies always caught up with you eventually. Her communicator crackled to life, making her jump. All personnel be advised, Queen Alara's shuttle is approaching. Repeat, Her Majesty is returning ahead of schedule. All senior staff report to docking bay for official reception. Finn opened her eyes and stared at the junction chamber ceiling, at the quantum flux regulator, humming with healthy coherence above her head. The Queen was coming home to find her dying ship mysteriously restored, and someone was going to have to explain how that had happened. Finn pulled herself to her feet with muscles that screamed in protest. She replaced the access panel, carefully collected her tools, and made her way back toward the populated sections of the ship. She had 72 hours to decide whether to step forward or stay silent, to own what she'd done or let it remain a mystery, to be invisible or be seen. The choice should have been easy, should have been obvious. But as Finn walked through corridors that were now properly lit past crew members who were celebrating the ship's miraculous recovery without knowing what had caused it, she realized the choice had already been made. Somewhere around hour 60 of working in the dark to save people who didn't know they needed saving. When she stepped into that junction chamber and decided that 15,000 lives mattered more than her career, the choice was made then. Everything after was just following through. Queen Alara Theron's shuttle touched down in the main docking bay with the precision of a blade finding its sheath. The assembled senior staff stood at attention, their formal uniforms immaculate, their expressions carefully neutral. Chief Engineer Davrin Torval stood at the front of the formation, his long Valerian ears angled forward in a display of respectful attention that couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. The shuttle's airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalized pressure. Queen Alara emerged into the light of the docking bay, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. She was tall, even by Valerian standards, her silver-white hair bound in the traditional crown braid that denoted royal lineage. Her robes flowed around her like liquid starlight, but it was her eyes that held attention, sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. She looked at her flagship through the bay's observation windows, at the running lights burning steady and strong, at the power distribution conduits glowing with healthy energy flow, at every system that should have been dark and dead showing full operational status. Her expression remained neutral, but Finn, watching from the back of the assembly through the bay's internal viewport, saw the slight tightening around her eyes. The Queen was not pleased, or perhaps she was too pleased in a way that suggested someone was about to have a very uncomfortable conversation. Chief Engineer Torval, Alara said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of formal Valerian overlaid with something harder. When I left for the diplomatic conference 4 days ago, you sent me a message. Do you recall what it said? Torval's ears flattened slightly. Yes, Your Majesty. Refresh my memory. The message stated that the Eternal Meridian had suffered catastrophic systems failure and would require a minimum of 4 months in a shipyard facility for comprehensive reconstruction. 4 months, Alara repeated, moving past him toward the bay exit. Her entourage fell in behind her like a wake trailing a ship. And yet here I stand on my flagship with every system operational. Please explain. Torval followed his voice, taking on the careful neutrality of someone navigating a minefield. Your Majesty, we are still investigating the anomaly. The primary systems restored themselves during the third night cycle. All 17 networks came online simultaneously. Simultaneously? Yes, Your Majesty. And this struck you as normal? No, Your Majesty, it struck us as impossible. Alara stopped walking, turned to face him directly. The corridor had gone silent. The junior officers in the entourage found fascinating details to study in the ceiling panels. Impossible, a word I've heard from you 14 times in the last 4 days. I'm beginning to wonder if your education was incomplete, Chief Engineer, because the evidence before me suggests that the impossible is not only possible, it happened while you were standing around declaring it couldn't. The restoration pattern suggests manual intervention, Torval said carefully. But no work orders were filed, no engineering teams were assigned to the repair, and frankly, Your Majesty, none of my staff possessed the expertise to resolve a cascade failure of this magnitude. The quantum flux regulator alone requires. I don't need a lecture on quantum flux regulators, Torval. I need to know who fixed my ship. We don't know, Your Majesty. Alara resumed, walking, her pace measured and deliberate. So you're telling me my ship fixed itself through sheer force of will, or perhaps divine intervention, because those are apparently more plausible explanations than your engineering corps solving a problem they're trained to solve. They reached the command deck lift. Alara paused before entering, looking out through the corridor viewport at the vast curve of her flagship's hull. I want every member of my crew assembled on the main deck in 1 hour, she said. Every single one. I don't care if they're sleeping, eating, or contemplating the mathematical mysteries of the universe. Everyone. Your Majesty, that's highly irregular. Torval. Alara's voice went very quiet, very cold. My flagship died and then resurrected itself without explanation. I believe we've moved well past irregular into the realm of things that demand my personal attention. Make it happen. Finn stood in the back ranks of the assembly, her gray coveralls feeling conspicuous among the formal uniforms and technical crew dress. She'd showered, changed into clean work clothes, and tried to look like someone who'd spent the last 3 days doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, forcing them still, and watched Queen Alara pace slowly across the raised platform that dominated the assembly deck. 347 personnel stood in perfect formation, arranged by department and rank. Every face carefully neutral, every posture radiating the kind of tension that came from knowing something important was happening, but not knowing what. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became unbearable. And then Finn stepped forward. The walk from the back ranks to the center of the assembly felt like crossing a continent. Every eye turned to follow her movement. Every face registered shock, confusion, disbelief. A human. The maintenance tech impossible. Finn reached the center point and stopped. Looked up at Queen Alara on the platform. Met those sharp, intelligent eyes and saw calculation happening behind them. Your Majesty, Finn said, her voice carrying across the silent deck. I fixed the ship. The walk to Queen Alara's personal technical facility felt like a death march dressed up as a royal procession, or possibly a victory parade disguised as an execution. Finn couldn't quite tell the difference anymore. They moved through the royal sections of the ship corridors Finn had only seen during maintenance rotations, spaces that gleamed with a level of polish and care that made Section 7's utilitarian tunnels look like they belonged on a different vessel entirely. Two royal guards flanked them, their ceremonial armor somehow managing to look both decorative and deeply functional. Queen Alara hadn't spoken since the assembly. Just that single command, come with me. The silence was its own form of interrogation. Finn felt every second of it pressing down on her shoulders. The shocked faces of the assembly replayed in her mind. Chief Engineer Torvald's expression, something between disbelief and what might have been professional humiliation. The whispers that had erupted as she'd walked toward the platform. Did she say she fixed it? A human maintenance tech? How is that possible? The technical facility occupied an entire wing of the palace complex, and Finn revised her expectations immediately upon entering. She'd assumed it would be ceremonial, a space maintained for appearances, maybe used for the occasional symbolic gesture. Instead, every surface showed signs of actual use. Workbenches scattered with partially disassembled components. Diagnostic stations running active scans. What appeared to be an entire propulsion assembly hanging from anti-gravity supports in the center of the room, its crystalline core exposed and surrounded by analysis equipment. This was a workshop, a real workshop, used by someone who actually understood the equipment instead of just owning it. You're surprised, Queen Alara said, watching Finn evaluate the space. I was expecting something more ceremonial, Your Majesty. Most people do. Alara moved to one of the workbenches, her robes sweeping across the floor like water. They see the crown and the title and assume I spend my days in political meetings and ceremonial functions. They forget that I commanded engineering teams before I inherited the throne, that I designed propulsion systems before I designed policy. She picked up a component from the workbench, something that looked like a crystalline sphere had gotten into an argument with a circuit board and lost badly. The damage was severe. Complete failure by any reasonable assessment. This is a multi-spectrum integration coupling from my personal shuttle's propulsion system, Alara said, turning the component over in her hands. It handles the interface between three different power systems, fusion core quantum drive, and conventional thrusters. 3 master engineers have examined it. All 3 declared it irreparable. Total replacement required with a 6-week wait for manufacturing. She held it out to Finn. I'd like your assessment. Finn accepted the coupling, carefully noting its weight distribution and the faint vibration of residual quantum energy still trapped in the damaged crystalline lattice. The sphere was cracked in 17 places. The circuit integration points were fused. The quantum resonance chamber was completely shattered. Is this a test? She asked. Everything is a test, Finn Marlowe. Alara's ears tilted forward slightly, an expression Finn had learned meant curiosity. The question is whether you realize you're being tested, which you clearly do, so we can skip the part where I pretend this is casual curiosity. Finn set the coupling on the workbench and pulled over a diagnostic scanner. The interface was different from the standard equipment she was used to, more sophisticated, with options and parameters that suggested someone had customized it extensively. Someone who knew exactly what they needed and wasn't satisfied with factory defaults. The readouts populated across the holographic display as Finn ran the initial scan. She studied them in silence, cross-referencing the quantum field patterns with what should have been there analyzing the failure cascade that had turned a functioning component into expensive scrap metal. Your engineers approach this as a hardware problem. Finn said, her hands moving through the diagnostic sequence automatically. They saw catastrophic physical damage and concluded the component was beyond repair. And they were wrong. They were looking at the wrong problem. Finn pulled up deeper layers of the diagnostic data examining the quantum resonance patterns still flickering in the damaged matrix. The physical damage is severe, yes, but it's not the root cause, it's the symptom. She highlighted a section of the quantum field analysis. The coupling's primary function is to maintain coherent quantum states across 3 different power systems operating on different frequencies. It's essentially a universal translator for energy-converting fusion output into quantum drive input into thruster control signals. I'm aware of the function. I designed the integration architecture. Finn glanced up, reassessing. Then you know the coupling doesn't just translate, it synchronizes. It has to maintain phase coherence across all 3 systems simultaneously, or you get feedback cascades, which is what happened here. No, Your Majesty. What happened here is that one of your shuttle's power systems underwent a firmware update that changed its base frequency by 0.03%, too small for standard diagnostics to flag as significant. But quantum synchronization operates on much tighter tolerances. Finn pulled up the phase coherence data showing the progressive drift over time. The coupling spent 6 months trying to synchronize systems that were now speaking slightly different dialects of the same language. The stress accumulated. The crystalline matrix started developing microfractures as it struggled to compensate. Those fractures disrupted the quantum field, which created more stress, which created more fractures. A cascade failure. Eventually, yes. The physical damage you see is the end result of months of the coupling slowly tearing itself apart, trying to do an impossible job. Alara studied the holographic display with an intensity that made Finn acutely aware that she was explaining quantum mechanics to someone who probably understood them better than she did. So the component isn't broken, Alara said slowly. It destroyed itself trying to function in an environment that no longer matched its operational parameters. Exactly. Can you fix it? Finn examined the coupling again, running calculations in her head. The physical damage was extensive, but the quantum resonance chamber, while shattered, still held residual coherence patterns. If she could extract those patterns, map them to a new matrix, and rebuild the synchronization protocols to account for the frequency drift. I can rebuild it, she said. Not repair the physical damage is too severe. But I can extract the quantum coherence patterns and reconstruct the coupling's core functionality in a new housing. It won't be identical to the original, but it will function. How long? Give me 4 hours. Alara's expression shifted, surprise quickly masked. The last engineer who examined this estimated 6 weeks for a complete replacement. The last engineer was waiting for manufacturing. I'm proposing reconstruction using components you already have in your workshop. Finn gestured at the storage cabinets lining the walls. Unless Your Majesty doesn't keep spare crystalline matrix blanks and quantum resonance chambers in her personal facility, I do. A slight smile played at the corners of Alara's mouth. 4 hours, then. I'll return to see what you have accomplished. She moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold. Finn Marlowe, why did you step forward in the assembly? You could have remained silent. Let the mystery stand. Avoided whatever consequences might come from admitting you accessed restricted systems without authorization. Finn thought about the question. About the 72 hours she'd spent in the junction chamber. About the simulation showing 15,000 casualties. About the choice she'd made to fix the problem instead of reporting it. Because lies always catch up with you eventually, Your Majesty, and I'm tired of living in the spaces between other people's attention. If I'm going to get in trouble for saving 15,000 lives, I'd rather own it than hide from it. Alara's smile became more genuine. An interesting philosophy. We'll see if you still hold it after the formal inquiry. Formal inquiry. You violated approximately 40 protocols, Finn Marlowe. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? Alara's tone was mild, almost amused. Consider this protective custody. Half my engineering corps is currently debating whether you're a genius or a security risk. I'd prefer to reach my own conclusions before they do something dramatic. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss of pressurization. Finn stood alone at the Queen's personal workshop, holding a destroyed propulsion coupling, surrounded by technology worth more than everything she'd ever owned combined, and tried to process the fact that she'd apparently been conscripted into being the royal household's consulting engineer, while under investigation for the unauthorized repair that had saved the ship. Well, she told the coupling, at least nobody can say life is boring. She got to work. 4 hours later, when Queen Alara returned, Finn had the reconstructed coupling assembled and running diagnostic tests. The new housing was elegant. She'd used a spare crystalline matrix from Alara's stock and carved it to match the original specifications, then integrated the salvaged quantum resonance patterns into the new structure. It wasn't identical to the original. The new matrix had different fracture resistance properties, which meant the quantum field dynamics were slightly different. But Finn had compensated by rebuilding the synchronization protocols from scratch, creating adaptive algorithms that could handle frequency drift without accumulating destructive stress. The result was actually better than the original. More robust, more fault-tolerant, capable of maintaining coherence across a wider range of operating conditions. Alara examined the coupling in silence, running her own diagnostic scans, checking Finn's work with the thoroughness of someone who actually understood what they were looking at. 3 hours and 47 minutes, she said finally. You finished ahead of schedule. The quantum resonance extraction took less time than I estimated. The original patterns were more stable than the physical damage suggested. And you rebuilt the synchronization protocols entirely. The old ones were designed for a static environment. I made them adaptive. They'll automatically compensate for minor frequency drifts in any of the 3 power systems. Should prevent this kind of cascade failure in the future. Alara set the coupling down carefully. You improved my design. I adapted your design to account for real-world conditions that weren't present when you originally created it. Your Majesty, the architecture was brilliant. It just needed updating. Diplomacy? Interesting. Alara moved to another workbench where several other damaged components were arranged in neat rows. How many of these do you think you can fix before the formal inquiry begins? Finn looked at the collection. A life support regulator with a cracked housing, a navigation interface showing signs of thermal stress, a power distribution node with corrupted control firmware, a sensor array that appeared to have been hit by a micrometeorite. All of them probably. But I should warn you, I'm going to violate at least a dozen more regulations in the process. Good, Alara smiled. I want evidence of what you can do when you're not constrained by rules designed for people with less capability. The inquiry will determine whether you should have access to these systems. I want to know what you'll accomplish with that access. She headed for the door again. Quarters have been arranged for you in the technical wing. Food synthesizers are calibrated for human dietary requirements. If you need anything, the staff will provide it. Your Majesty, what happens if the inquiry decides I shouldn't have done what I did? Alara paused, looking back over her shoulder. Then I'll have an interesting conversation with my engineering directorate about the difference between following protocol and achieving results. But I suspect we won't reach that point. You saved my ship, Finn Marlowe. The inquiry will determine the details. The outcome is already decided. She left. Finn stood in the workshop, surrounded by broken things waiting to be fixed, and felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief the inquiry was still coming and there were still consequences waiting, but something like hope, like possibility, like maybe for the first time in 5 years, she'd found a place where competence mattered more than credentials. She picked up the life support regulator and got to work. The whispers started the next morning. Finn heard them through the workshop's ventilation system, voices carrying from the corridor outside, engineers and technicians passing by on their way to other assignments. Keeping the human here. Ridiculous, a maintenance technician thinks she can insult to everyone who actually earned their position. She ignored them and focused on the power distribution node. The corruption in its control firmware was interesting, not a random failure, but a specific pattern that suggested deliberate stress application. She made a note to mention it to Queen Alara later. The door chimed. Finn looked up to find a Valerian male in formal engineering robes standing in the doorway. Senior-grade insignia, multiple commendation pins. The kind of credentials that came with decades of service and political connections. You're the human, he said. Not a question, An accusation. Finn Marlowe, she replied, setting down the diagnostic scanner. And you are Chief Technical Advisor Kelvin Thrace. I've served the royal household for 32 years. He moved into the workshop like he owned it, examining the reconstructed propulsion coupling with obvious disdain. I was one of the 3 engineers who declared that coupling unsalvageable. I'm curious to see what miracles you think you performed. Finn recognized the tone, had heard variations of it for 2 years, the dismissal, the condescension, the underlying current of resentment that someone outside the approved hierarchy dared to exist in the same professional space. No miracles, she said evenly, just component reconstruction using quantum resonance pattern extraction. The technique is documented in the Valerian Engineering, Quarterly Volume 47, Issue 3. I'm familiar with the literature. The technique requires specialized equipment and certification in quantum matrix manipulation. It requires understanding of quantum coherence principles and access to basic crystalline fabrication tools, both of which are available in this workshop. Thrace's ears flattened a Valerian expression of irritation. Your unauthorized repair of the quantum flux regulator has created significant concerns. Protocol exists for a reason. Allowing unqualified personnel to access critical systems sets a dangerous precedent. The precedent where ships don't explode? Yes, that does seem dangerous. Your insolence is noted. So is your failure to diagnose a problem that nearly killed 3,000 people. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Thrace stepped closer, using it his height advantage to loom over the workbench. You are a maintenance technician 3rd grade. You have no formal engineering credentials, no academy training, no authorization to be in this facility, let alone working on royal equipment. His voice went very quiet. The fact that Her Majesty is momentarily amused by your presumption does not change what you are. Finn met his gaze steadily. And what am I? A human who got lucky once and is about to discover that luck runs out. He turned and left his robe swirling dramatically. Finn waited until the door closed before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking again. Not with fear, this time with anger. The cold, focused kind that came from being dismissed and belittled by people who confused credentials with capability. She'd made an enemy, a powerful one, someone who'd spent 3 decades building connections and influence, who now saw his position threatened by an outsider. The rational part of her brain suggested backing down, being apologetic, making herself small and unthreatening. The rest of her brain told the rational part to shut up and get back to work. She picked up the diagnostic scanner and continued analyzing the power distribution node. If Kelvin Thrace wanted a fight, he'd get one, but it would be fought with competence, not politics, with results, not credentials. Finn had spent 5 years learning that the truth always won eventually, even if it took a while to get there. By the 3rd day, Finn had solved every problem Queen Alara had presented. The propulsion coupling reconstructed and improved. The life support regulator turned out the crack in the housing was creating a pressure differential that made the component think it was failing when it was actually fine. The navigation interface thermal stress had corrupted a memory buffer, fixable with a complete reset and some improved heat shielding. The power distribution node firmware corruption caused by what Finn was now certain was deliberate tampering, though she couldn't prove it yet. The sensor array micrometeorite damage repaired using creative welding techniques and some very precise calibration. Each solution was documented, filed properly, presented with appropriate technical justification. Each solution made Chief Technical Advisor Thrace's expression darker when he made his daily visit to the workshop. Queen Alara came every evening, bringing new problems, watching Finn work, asking questions that seemed casual but probed deep into her methodology and thinking. They fell into a rhythm. Alara would present the impossible, Finn would find the improbable solution, and they discussed the gap between what people assumed was true and what actually was. Why did you leave Earth? Alara asked on the 3rd evening, while Finn was running final diagnostics on the sensor array. The question came without preamble, without warning. Finn's hands paused on the controls for just a moment before continuing to their work. I reported safety violations at the company where I worked, she said. Falsified inspection reports, components that were signed off as functional when they were actually defective. People died when one of those components failed. And they punished you for revealing this. They fired me, sued me for breach of contract and corporate espionage, blacklisted me from every engineering firm on Earth. Finn pulled up the final diagnostic results, perfect coherence across all sensor bands. I spent 2 years fighting the lawsuit, won technically, but winning a lawsuit doesn't undo a blacklist. So you left the planet. Only place I could get work was off-world. Turns out the Valerian Empire doesn't care about Earth blacklists when hiring humans for basic maintenance. The credentials they wouldn't recognize as an engineer worked fine as a ticket to clean air filters. You could have lied, could have hidden your engineering background. I spent 2 years learning that lies will always catch up with you eventually. Seemed easier to just accept what I was allowed to be and stop fighting. Finn closed out the diagnostic interface. At least that's what I told myself. Right up until I saw 15,000 people about to die because nobody else was looking at the right problem. Alara studied her in silence for a long moment. "Tomorrow," she said, "the formal inquiry begins. Commander Vex Kalan will be leading the investigation." Security Commander, I thought this would be handled by the Engineering Directorate. It was, until Thrace filed formal sabotage charges yesterday. Once sabotage is alleged, it becomes a security matter. Alara's expression was unreadable. Vex is thorough, fair by reputation, but he's also deeply traditional. The kind of officer who believes the old ways exist for good reasons. "You're warning me. I'm informing you of what you're walking into. There's a difference." Alara moved toward the door. "The inquiry convenes at first light. Prepare your defense. And Finn, don't apologize for saving lives. Own what you did." Finn spent the night reviewing the data she'd collected during the repair, building her case, preparing to defend decisions she'd made in the dark when with 15,000 lives on the line and nobody to ask permission from. She was still working when the sun rose over the palace complex, painting the technical wing in shades of gold and amber. The formal inquiry would determine whether she'd violated protocol or saved a ship, whether competence mattered more than credentials, whether the Empire could accept that sometimes the person who saw the problem coming was the person nobody expected. Finn closed her datapad and headed for the inquiry chamber. Time to own what she'd done. But that night, in another part of the palace complex, Chief Engineer Davrin Torval sat alone in his office, unable to sleep. He'd been reviewing Finn's repair data for 3 days, looking for mistakes, for evidence that the human had gotten lucky, for anything that would justify the formal inquiry and the sabotage charges that Thrace had filed. Instead, he'd found genius, not luck, not accident, careful, methodical problem-solving that demonstrated a depth of understanding that most of his senior engineers didn't possess. Finn had documented everything: her diagnostic process, her reasoning, her calculations. The work was flawless, more than flawless. It was brilliant, and it made Torval feel sick, because he'd declared the quantum flux regulator problem impossible, had told the Queen they needed 4 months in a shipyard, had given up without even considering the possibility that the solution might be unconventional. A human maintenance technician had proven him wrong in 72 hours. The humiliation burned. But what burned worse was the realization that his pride might have killed 15,000 people if Finn hadn't acted. Torval pulled up another data file, one he'd been investigating privately for the past 2 days. The power distribution node that Finn had flagged as showing signs of deliberate tampering. He'd dismissed it initially. Equipment failed, corruption happened. No need to see conspiracy where simple malfunction was more likely. But he'd checked anyway, because Finn's instincts had been right about everything else. The access logs told a story. Repeated entries to the junction chamber over the past 14 months, not from engineering personnel, from security clearances. Specifically, from Commander Vex Kalan's security codes. Torval sat back in his chair, feeling ice settle in his gut. Vex was leading the inquiry, the same Vex whose access codes showed him entering restricted areas with no documented purpose. The same Vex who was known to lead the traditionalist faction within the military, the officers who believed human integration into the Empire was a mistake. It could be coincidence, could be legitimate security inspections that hadn't been properly documented, or it could be something much darker. Torval made a decision he knew he couldn't unmake. He activated his personal recording device, hidden in his insignia pin, and sent a message requesting a private meeting with Commander Vex. If there was an innocent explanation, he'd apologize for the suspicion. If there wasn't, Torval thought about 15,000 lives, about a human maintenance technician who'd risked everything to save them, about 40 years of service built on credentials and protocol, and the assumption that the system worked. If there wasn't an innocent explanation, then the system was broken, and it was time for someone to fix it. The Imperial Tribunal Chamber was designed to make people feel small. High ceilings that stretched 30 meters overhead, walls of polished stone that had witnessed 3 centuries of legal proceedings, seating arranged in concentric circles that put the accused at the lowest point, looking up at judges, advisors, and observers who literally held the high ground. Finn stood at the center point alone and refused to let the architecture intimidate her. The chamber was packed, every seat filled. Standing room only along the back walls. This wasn't just a tribunal anymore, it had become theater. Entertainment, a spectacle where the upstart human would finally be put in her place by the established order. The viewing gallery hummed with whispered conversations in Valerian fragments of speculation and judgment floating down like ash. Queen Alara sat in the royal observation box, her expression unreadable. She'd visited Finn's quarters once in the past 12 hours, said nothing about the charges, just asked technical questions about quantum field dynamics and crystalline matrix reconstruction, then left without offering reassurance or condemnation. Finn had no idea which way this would go. The tribunal judges entered 3 senior jurists in traditional robes, their combined service spanning over a century. They took their seats with the deliberate gravity of people who understood the weight of their decisions. The lead judge, an elderly Valerian woman whose white hair and deeply lined face spoke of decades spent in these chambers, activated the proceedings with a gesture. This tribunal convenes to examine charges of sabotage and manipulation against Finn Marlowe, human citizen maintenance technician 3rd grade currently assigned to the royal flagship Eternal Meridian. Her voice carried across the chamber with surprising strength. The accused stands before us to answer these allegations. How do you plead? Finn kept her voice steady. Not guilty, Your Honor. So noted, the judge gestured to the prosecution table. Commander Vex Kalan, you may present your case. Finn's attention snapped to the prosecutor, and something cold settled in her chest. She'd expected Chief Technical Advisor Thrace to lead the prosecution. He'd been the visible face of the opposition, the one making accusations and spreading whispers about the dangerous human who'd violated protocol. Instead, Commander Vex Kalan stood the Eternal Meridian's Deputy Security Commander, a decorated officer with a service record that included combat citations and commendations for valor. His presence shifted this from a professional dispute into something bigger, something with teeth. Vex moved to the presentation platform with military precision. His uniform was immaculate. His bearing suggested absolute confidence. Honored judges, he began, his voice carrying the clipped formality of command briefings. The evidence will show a pattern of deception, unauthorized access, and deliberate manipulation designed to advance the accused's position within the royal household. Holographic displays activated around the chamber showing access logs, technical schematics, timelines. 6 months prior to the catastrophic failure of the Eternal Meridian maintenance logs show Finn Marlowe accessing Section 7 Delta, the precise location of the quantum flux regulator. Vex highlighted the relevant entries. These accesses occurred during off-duty hours, without authorization, without filed work orders. The murmur in the gallery grew louder. Financial records from Earth show the accused carrying significant debt from previous employment disputes. More data populated the displays. This establishes motive, a desperate individual seeking advancement by any means necessary. Vex paused for effect, letting the implications settle. Finally, testimony from engineering personnel indicates the accused made statements suggesting foreknowledge of the ship's vulnerabilities, claiming essentially to possess unique understanding of systems that senior engineers with decades of experience failed to diagnose. He turned to face Finn directly. The prosecution contends that Finn Marlowe deliberately degraded the quantum flux regulator over a period of months, creating a failure she knew she could repair, then positioned herself to discover the problem and gain Her Majesty's favor through this manufactured crisis. The gallery erupted. Shouts of outrage, calls for justice. The judges had to call for order twice before the noise subsided. Finn stood very still, her mind racing. The prosecution's case was more sophisticated than she'd expected. They'd woven truth and fiction together so seamlessly that separating them would require technical knowledge most of the tribunal didn't possess. The access logs were real. She had been in Section 7 Delta 6 months ago. Routine maintenance on ventilation systems that happened to be near the regulator access point. But the logs had been stripped of context, making innocent work look suspicious. The financial records were real. The debt was real. But it came from legal fees fighting corporate corruption on Earth, not desperation for advancement. The testimony about bragging was pure fiction. But who would the tribunal believe? Decorated officers with decades of service, or a human maintenance technician with 3 years in the Empire? The accused may present her defense, the lead judge said. Finn stepped forward. No holographics, no prepared presentation, just her voice and the truth. I didn't sabotage the eternal meridian, she said simply. I fixed it. Everything else is people trying to destroy me because I made them look bad. Not the most diplomatic approach, but she was done being diplomatic. The access logs show me doing my job, maintaining ventilation systems. The financial records show me fighting corruption on Earth, which is exactly why I recognized a cover-up when I saw one here. She gestured at the holographic displays. And I never bragged about anything. I spent 2 years being invisible because that's what humans do in the Empire. We stay quiet. We don't make waves. We definitely don't draw attention to ourselves by fixing problems everyone else declared impossible. She turned to address the gallery directly. But I couldn't stay quiet when I ran the simulations, when I saw what would happen if nobody fixed that regulator. Her voice went quieter, harder. 15,247 people would have died. 3,000 crew, 12,000 civilians on the colony station. Dead because a component degraded over 37 years and nobody noticed. The chamber had gone silent. So I fixed it, without permission, without authorization, because waiting for permission meant watching people die. Finn looked at the judges. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty, but it's the only crime I committed. Vex stood smoothly, an emotional appeal, but emotion doesn't change evidence. The accused had motive, means, and opportunity. The technical analysis supports nothing, a new voice interrupted. Every head in the chamber turned. Chief Engineer Davrin Torval stood at the chamber entrance, a data crystal clutched in his hand. His formal robes were disheveled, his ears angled back in distress. He looked like someone who'd been awake for 3 days straight, wrestling with his conscience, and losing. I request permission to submit evidence to the tribunal, he said, his voice shaking slightly. The lead judge frowned. Chief Engineer Torval, this is highly irregular. The evidentiary period has closed. This evidence directly contradicts the prosecution's case. It reveals criminal conspiracy and attempted mass murder. Torval moved forward, each step deliberate. I respectfully submit that the tribunal needs to see it before rendering judgment. The judges conferred quietly. Finally, the lead judge nodded. The tribunal will permit submission. Proceed. Torval inserted the data crystal into the presentation system. His hands were shaking. 3 days ago, I confronted Commander Vex Kalan privately regarding inconsistencies in the evidence against Finn Marlowe. He pulled up the audio interface. I recorded that conversation. He activated the playback. Vex's voice filled the chamber, tinny from the recording but unmistakable. I didn't sabotage the ship, you fool. I've been degrading that regulator for over a year. Carefully, precisely, making it look like natural aging so nobody would question it when it finally failed. The gallery exploded, shouts, gasps, the judges calling for order. The recording continued. The plan was perfect. Let the regulator fail catastrophically during the return jump. Blame it on human infiltration. Use the tragedy to expel every human from the Empire. Finally purge the contamination that's been weakening us. Torval's recorded voice. But the human fixed it. Yes, the cursed human fixed it. And now I have to destroy her credibility before anyone realizes what she prevented. Before anyone asks the right questions about how a maintenance technician diagnosed what my entire engineering staff missed. More voices on the recording, Vex explaining his ideology in chilling detail. The Valerian Empire stood pure for 800 years before human contamination. 15,000 deaths, a necessary sacrifice. Half would have been humans and human sympathizers anyway. The remaining Valerians would have understood we purged the weakness. The Empire would emerge stronger, purer, as it was meant to be. Torvald's voice barely audible. You're describing genocide. I'm describing necessary measures to preserve our civilization. But the human ruined it, so now I ruin her. Fabricate evidence, manufacture testimony, use her Earth debts and her unauthorized access to make her look desperate and dangerous. The tribunal will condemn her. She'll be expelled, and I'll find another way to complete the purge. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. The kind that came when reality shifted beneath everyone's feet. Vex was already moving. His hand went to his sidearm, but the weapon wasn't there, confiscated at the tribunal entrance. Standard procedure for security. The gesture alone was damning. Royal guards swarmed him anyway, tackling him to the floor before he could do more than take 2 steps. Lies, Vex shouted, struggling against the guards. Fabricated evidence. The human corrupted him. This is exactly the contamination I warned about. Treason, someone shouted from the gallery. Attempted genocide. Arrest him. The chamber descended into chaos. People screaming, scrambling for exits. The judges shouting for order, while guards swarmed the prosecution table. Through it all, Finn stood frozen at the center point, trying to process what she'd just heard. Vex had sabotaged the ship, had planned to kill 15,000 people, had been willing to commit genocide to advance his political agenda of human expulsion from the Empire. And she'd stopped him, not just by fixing the regulator, but by being good enough that her success forced the conspiracy into the open. The guards dragged Vex out of the chamber. He was still shouting about purity and tradition and keeping the Empire clean, but the words were lost in the general pandemonium. It took 20 minutes for order to be restored. When the chamber finally quieted, the lead judge looked at Torvald with an expression somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion. Chief Engineer, do you have additional evidence to present? Yes, Your Honor. Torvald pulled up new holographics, his voice steadying as he moved into technical territory. I ran comprehensive forensic analysis on the quantum flux regulator. The degradation pattern shows deliberate stress application, someone repeatedly overloading specific crystalline bonds in a way that would appear natural but accelerate failure. The holographics showed molecular-level imaging of the regulator's crystal structure. Finn recognized the patterns immediately. They matched what she'd compensated for in her recalibration, but she'd assumed it was natural aging. Access logs show Commander Vex entered the junction chamber on 17 occasions over the past 14 months, each time correlated with a documented stress event on the regulator. Torvald highlighted the timeline. He was deliberately destroying it, slowly, creating a disaster he could blame on human saboteurs. He pulled up another display, this one showing Finn's repair work in meticulous detail. Finn Marlowe's recalibration didn't just fix the regulator. She documented everything she found, including anomalies in the degradation pattern that suggested external tampering. Torvald's voice cracked slightly. I reviewed her notes 3 days ago. That's when I started investigating. That's when I confronted Vex. That's when I discovered the conspiracy. He turned to face Finn directly. She didn't sabotage the ship. She saved it. Saved all of us. And he stopped. Started again. I let prejudice blind me to the truth. I declared the problem impossible rather than listening to the one person who understood what was actually happening. I failed my duty, failed my crew, failed Her Majesty. His ears flattened completely against his head, the Valerian expression of profound shame. This human showed more courage and competence in 72 hours than I've shown in 40 years of service. The tribunal should commend her, not condemn her. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The lead judge looked at Finn. Does the defense have anything to add? Finn found her voice. I ran additional analysis while in detention. The simulation models I built to understand the regulator degradation showed something I didn't recognize at the time, deliberate stress patterns. I thought they were data artifacts. She pulled up her own data on the public displays showing the cascade failure projections she'd run 5 days ago. If nobody had fixed the regulator, the next FTL transition would have triggered core breach, total ship destruction. The blast radius would have caught Colony Station Meridian 7. The simulation played out in holographic detail showing the expanding sphere of destruction, showing the casualty count rising. Final estimate 15,247 lives lost. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation, like a weight. I fixed it because I couldn't let that happen. Not because I wanted recognition. Not because I was trying to manipulate anyone. Finn looked at the judges, at the gallery, at the faces that had been so certain she was guilty. I fixed it because it needed fixing and I was the only one who saw it. She paused, let the silence build. And if that's a crime, then maybe the problem isn't with me. Maybe it's with a system that values credentials more than capability. That assumes competence can only come from approved sources. That would rather let 15,000 people die than admit that sometimes the person who sees the solution is the person nobody expected. The lead judge sat back in her chair. This tribunal will recess for deliberation. The deliberation took 12 minutes. When the judges returned, the lead judge's expression was grave. This tribunal finds Finn Marlowe not guilty of all charges. The chamber erupted in applause. Cheers from the junior engineers in the back rows, relief from the gallery. Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice cutting through the noise. We find overwhelming evidence of criminal conspiracy, attempted mass murder, and gross dereliction of duty by Commander Vex Kalan and any co-conspirators who assisted in this plot. She looked at the security commander at the back of the chamber. Arrest warrants are issued for all individuals involved in the fabrication of evidence and the sabotage of royal vessels. The investigation will continue until every participant is identified and brought to justice. The chamber quieted. This tribunal also recommends that Chief Engineer Davrin Torval be commended for his courage in bringing evidence forward despite personal and professional cost. The judge's expression softened slightly. It takes strength to admit when we've been wrong. It takes more strength to act on that admission when doing so exposes our own failures. She turned her attention to Finn. And we recommend that Finn Marlowe be officially recognized for preventing a catastrophic loss of life through her technical expertise, moral courage, and willingness to act when action was required. The fact that she violated protocol in doing so speaks to a failure in our systems, not a failure in her judgment. The judge stood, signaling the formal conclusion of proceedings. Let it be entered into the record that sometimes the rules must be broken to achieve what the rules were designed to protect. Let it also be entered that competence and capability are not defined by credentials, but by results. And let it be known that the Empire owes Finn Marlowe a debt that can never be fully repaid. This tribunal is adjourned. The chamber erupted again. This time in celebration, junior technicians rushed forward. Engineering staff who'd been watching from the galleries descended to shake Finn's hand, to apologize for doubting her, to thank her for saving lives they hadn't known were in danger. Through the crowd, Finn saw Chief Engineer Torval approaching. His long ears were still angled downward in shame, but his expression had shifted into something like hope. I owe you an apology, he said quietly when he reached her. Several apologies for doubting you, for not seeing what Vex was doing, for letting my pride prevent me from recognizing competence when it was standing right in front of me. You came forward, Finn replied. That took courage. It took too long. Torval extended his hand in the human gesture of reconciliation he'd clearly researched. I've spent 40 years believing credentials mattered more than capability. You proved me wrong. I'm grateful for the lesson, even if learning it was painful. Finn shook his hand. Just help me make sure other people don't have to fight this hard to be heard. That, Torval said with a slight smile, is exactly what I intend to do. The gallery had mostly cleared when Queen Alara descended from her observation box. She moved with unhurried grace, her silver robes flowing around her like water. The remaining observers parted respectfully. Walk with me, she said to Finn. Not a command, an invitation. They left the tribunal chamber, two royal guards falling into escort positions at a discreet distance. The palace corridors were quiet in the afternoon cycle, most personnel at their duty stations. Finn waited for Alara to speak, waited for judgment or praise or whatever came next. The queen remained silent until they reached a private garden, a space enclosed by crystal walls that overlooked the capital city spreading out below. I knew the charges were false, Alara said finally, looking out over the city. The technical analysis of your work was too flawless. The timeline too clean, but I needed to see how you'd handle the pressure. That's a hell of a test, Your Majesty. Leadership isn't about comfort. It's about making hard choices under impossible circumstances. Alara turned to face her. I've been queen for 23 years. I've learned that the people who flourish when everything is comfortable often crumble when things get difficult. She moved closer, her expression serious. You didn't crumble. You got angry. But you channeled that anger into clear thinking and direct communication. You defended yourself without attacking your accusers personally. You stood alone at the center of that chamber and refused to be made small. I didn't feel like I was doing anything special, Finn said. I was just trying to survive. That's what makes it special. You didn't perform courage for an audience. You just had it. Alara moved to the garden's edge, the setting sun catching her hair and turning it into spun silver and gold. I'm reforming the Empire's technical services, creating a new division called the Innovation Corps. Merit-based, species-blind, open to anyone with the capability to do the work regardless of where they came from or what credentials they carry. She looked back at Finn. I want you to lead it. The words didn't quite make sense. Finn stared at the Queen, waiting for the qualification, the catch, the caveat. None came. Your Majesty, I'm not qualified to lead anything. I'm a maintenance technician. Stop. Alara's voice went sharp. Don't diminish what you accomplished. You saved 15,000 lives. You diagnosed a problem that defeated engineers with 40 years of experience. You stood trial for doing the right thing and defended yourself with clarity and strength. She stepped closer. Those are the qualifications that matter. Everything else, the certifications, the academy degrees, the official credentials, those are just pieces of paper that say you attended classes. They don't measure what you can actually do when everything is on the line. Finn felt something shifting in her chest. The old defensive reflexes, the habit of making herself small and unthreatening, warring with a newer possibility. The possibility of being seen, being valued, being trusted with responsibility that matched her capabilities. I still maintain my own equipment, she said finally. It keeps me grounded. Alara smiled. I wouldn't expect anything else. The best leaders never forget what the work actually looks like. Then yes, Your Majesty, I'll do it. Good. Alara extended her hand and Finn shook it, the human gesture of agreement adopted now by the Queen of a galactic empire. You start immediately. I'll assign you staff, resources, authority to hire based on capability regardless of background. She pulled a small crystal from her robes, a rank insignia, Chief Engineer, equal status with Torval, direct authority over all Innovation Corps operations, and the power to override traditional engineering decisions when necessary. Finn accepted the crystal, feeling its weight in her palm. Such a small thing, such massive implications. Some people are going to hate this, she said. Many people already hate it. Change is uncomfortable. Progress threatens those who have built their positions on the old systems. Alara's expression went serious. You'll face opposition, some of it professional, some of it personal. Some of it will come from places you don't expect. I know. I've been there before. The difference now is you won't face it alone. You'll have resources, support, and most importantly, you'll have the authority to build something better. They stood in the garden as the sun sank toward the horizon, turning the city below into a landscape of light and shadow. Thank you, Finn said quietly, for believing in me. I don't believe in you, Alara replied. I observed you, tested you, saw what you could do when everything was on the line. That's not belief, that's evidence. The assembly deck of the Eternal Meridian held 347 souls, but this time nobody was frozen in shock. Finn stood at the platform's edge where Queen Alara had stood a year ago, looking out at faces that had once stared at her with disbelief. Some of those faces had softened. Some remained skeptical. All of them were listening. She wore the chief engineer insignia now, the formal robes of her position. But beneath the ceremony, she was still the same person who'd spent 72 hours in a maintenance tunnel fixing a dying ship. The Innovation Corps graduated its third cohort today, Finn said, her voice carrying across the deck without need for amplification. She'd learned that trick from Alara. 29 engineers from 8 different species. Selected not for their credentials, but for what they can do when everyone else says it's impossible. She saw Rowan Cassidy in the front row now wearing senior engineer insignia, the young Valerian who'd discovered the timestamp inconsistencies in Vex's fabricated evidence, who'd risked her career to help expose the conspiracy. Saw Chief Engineer Torval standing with the traditional engineering staff, his expression one of quiet pride. They'd spent the past year working together, bridging the gap between old methods and new thinking. Saw young technicians in the back ranks, human Valerian, others watching with the hunger of people who finally believed they had a chance. A year ago, I stood in this room and admitted I'd broken 40 regulations to fix this ship. Finn's voice carried steady and clear. Today, half those regulations have been rewritten. The other half are under review, because we learned something important. She paused, let the silence build the way Alara had taught her. Competence matters more than credentials. Character matters more than species. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person who sees what everyone else missed. Queen Alara sat in the royal observation box, her expression showing the satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as intended. She'd known a year ago what this moment would be, had been building toward it from the moment Finn stepped forward in an assembly and said she'd fix the ship. The Perseus 9 crisis was resolved in 4 days, Finn continued, because a team of unqualified engineers approached it without assuming it was impossible. 3 more stations have requested Innovation Corps assistance. The Empire is learning. She looked directly at the section where maintenance crews stood, the people still cleaning filters and replacing gaskets, still being overlooked by everyone who mattered. If you see something broken and you know how to fix it, don't wait for permission. Don't let anyone tell you you're not qualified. Just fix it. Own the choice. Face the consequences. Finn smiled slightly. Worst case, you'll end up running a division and reforming an empire. So you know, minimal risk. The assembly laughed genuine laughter that broke the formal tension. Some things had changed in a year. The Innovation Corps existed. The regulations had been rewritten. The Empire was slowly accepting that capability mattered more than credentials. But some things stayed the same. Finn's dry humor, her refusal to take herself too seriously, her understanding that the best way to make people comfortable with change was to show them it wasn't as scary as they thought. The assembly concluded with the formal protocols. Finn accepted commendations on behalf of the Innovation Corps, recognized individuals who demonstrated exceptional capability, made announcements about new initiatives and expanded programs. All the ceremonial requirements of her position. But later, when the assembly had cleared and the formal robes had been stored away, Finn made her way to the maintenance section of the Innovation Corps facility, down on the lower level, away from the administration offices and formal training spaces. Just workshops and equipment, storage, and the comfortable smell of machine oil and recycled air. Her old maintenance kit sat on a shelf exactly where she'd left it a year ago. The worn tools, the modified work light, the things that had defined her life before everything changed. She was checking the calibration on a diagnostic scanner when a young technician approached hesitantly. Human, maybe 22, wearing the Innovation Corps trainee insignia. Chief Engineer Marlowe, I have a question about the power coupling I'm working on. Everyone says it's impossible to repair, but I think maybe if I... Show me, Finn said. They walked to the trainee's workbench together. The coupling was a mess, fractured housing, misaligned quantum fields, the kind of damage that made most engineers reach for the recycling bin. Finn picked it up, felt its weight, examined the fracture patterns with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years fixing things everyone else had given up on. It's not impossible, she said, just not obvious. The housing fractures are creating stress in the quantum field. Fix the field alignment first, reinforce the weak points, and the housing damage becomes manageable. The trainee's face lit up. That's what I thought, but my instructor said I was wasting time. Your instructor is wrong. Trust your instincts. If you can see a way to fix something, try it. Worst case, you learn what doesn't work. She handed the coupling back. And when you solve it, not if, when, document everything. Make sure the next person who faces this problem has your solution to learn from. The trainee nodded enthusiastically and returned to work with renewed energy. Finn collected her old maintenance kit, added some tools she'd need for the upcoming mission, and headed for the transport bay. Another crisis on the frontier. Another impossible problem. Another chance to prove that capability mattered more than credentials. As she walked through the Innovation Core facility, she passed workshops full of people solving problems everyone else had declared unsolvable. Training rooms full of students learning that credentials mattered less than competence. Offices full of engineers from a dozen different backgrounds working together because they were good at what they did. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. There were still people who resented the Innovation Core, still bureaucrats who tried to block reforms, still deep-seated prejudices that would take generations to fully overcome. But it was better, measurably, documentably better. And it had started because a maintenance technician couldn't walk away from a broken ship. The transport was waiting in the bay, its engines already cycling up. Rowan Cassidy stood at the airlock with two other core engineers reviewing technical data on portable terminals. "Ready to go fix the impossible?" Rowan asked as Finn approached. Finn thought about the question, about the station waiting out there with 1,500 people depending on failing systems, about the challenges they'd face and the solutions they'd have to invent, about coming back and training the next generation and pushing the Empire toward a future where capability mattered more than credentials. "Always," she said and stepped aboard. The transport lifted smoothly, rising through the palace complex and into the open sky. Through the viewport, Finn could see the capital city spreading out below, then the curve of the planet, then the vast darkness of space dotted with stars. Somewhere out there, a station was dying, and a team of engineers who'd been told they couldn't possibly fix it were about to prove otherwise. Queen Alara watched the transport's departure from her private observatory, a data pad in her hand showing the mission parameters. Another crisis, another impossible problem. Another chance for the Innovation Core to demonstrate that the Empire's future belonged to those who could solve problems, not those who could recite credentials. She pulled up a secondary file, one marked with the highest security clearance. A message that had arrived that morning from deep space. An anomaly detected near the frontier. Something that didn't match any known technology or phenomenon. Something impossible. Alara smiled and marked the file for Finn's attention upon her return. Because impossible just meant nobody had solved it yet, and the Empire had finally learned to value the people who were best at solving impossible problems. The ones everyone else overlooked. The ones who saw broken things and couldn't walk away. The ones who understood that sometimes the most important qualification was the willingness to try when everyone else had given up. In the transport climbing toward the stars, Finn closed her eyes and let the hum of the engines carry her toward whatever impossible thing waited in the dark. She'd saved 15,000 lives a year ago. Fixed a ship everyone said was broken beyond repair. Built an organization that was changing how an entire empire thought about capability and credentials. And she'd done it all starting from a maintenance tunnel with worn tools and a modified work light because she'd seen a problem that needed solving and hadn't waited for permission to solve it. The future was full of impossible problems. But Finn Marlowe had gotten very good at being the first person to solve them.